Every morning for 20 years, Eli Calloway walked down to the same bend in the Verde River before the sun came up. Same spot, same cold coffee, same 15 minutes of silence before the world started wanting things from him. He never told anyone why he did it. He barely knew himself. It was just the one place where nobody needed anything from him, and the river kept moving, and that was enough. Until the morning she was already there. A woman he had never seen, standing in his spot, looking at his river, like she had every right to be there, like she had been there before. And the strangest part, the part that stayed with him longer than anything else, was that his old mare Cleo, who backed away from every stranger who came through that barn, walked straight toward her and dropped her head. Eli didn't know it yet, but that woman wasn't a stranger to this land, and the truth she was carrying would cost both of them more than a simple misunderstanding. It would cost them the one thing neither of them knew they still had left to lose. This channel is home to stories of the American West, stories about cowboys and open land, about love that grows slowly like dry ground cotton, about the ties between mothers and children, neighbors and strangers, and the quiet ways people find each other when they've stopped looking. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, you're in the right place. This story carries a lesson worth sitting with. The people who show up in your hardest season are rarely there by accident. And sometimes, the land you think you're fighting to keep is actually fighting to bring something back to you. If this story moved something in you, let us know in the comments. We read every single one. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's not too late to start over. Hit like if you believe that the right person can change the way you see a place you've known your whole life. And subscribe, because we put out a new story every week, and we'd hate for you to miss the next one.
The Verde River does not care about your problems. Eli Calloway had known this for a long time. 20 years, give or take. 20 years of standing at the same bend in the water, same hour, same cold coffee going colder in his hand, watching the river do what rivers do. Move. Keep moving. Not for him, not despite him. Just moving because that is what water does when you give it a channel and a grade and enough time. It was October. 4:47 in the morning by the little clock above the kitchen sink, which ran 3 minutes fast and which Eli had never corrected because his father set it that way, and some things you leave alone. The fog was low on the water. Arizona fog in October is a quiet thing. It sits close to the surface, and it makes the world look undecided, like the day hasn't committed yet to what it's going to be. Eli stood at the river's edge in his work boots and his canvas jacket with the torn left pocket, and he held his mug in both hands, and he watched the fog. He was not praying. He was not planning. He was not, as his ex-wife Margaret once suggested with a particular tiredness in her voice, communing with anything. He was just standing there, the way a man stands in the one place where nobody wants anything from him. He had 15 minutes before the day started wanting things. The mug had gone cold somewhere around the 10-minute mark. He drank it anyway. Behind him, if he turned around, he would see the ranch. 340 acres of Verde River corridor, rolling into juniper and scrub oak as the land climbed away from the water. A barn that needed its east roof patched. A water pump that needed new seals. 12 head of cattle where there used to be 80. 1 horse where there used to be 6. 0 hired hands where there used to be 3, since Hector left in September, quietly, apologetically, because Eli couldn't make the payroll and Hector had a family, and some things cannot be asked of people. Eli did not turn around. In his jacket pocket, the good pocket, the right one, was an envelope from Merritt County Bank. He didn't need to open it. He had read it enough times to have it in his head word for word. The balance, the interest rate. The due date in red, November 15th, 36 days from this morning. Dale Merritt, who ran the bank and who Eli had known for 30 years, had offered one suggestion in the letter. A developer group out of Phoenix was interested in the Verde River corridor. Residential, maybe resort, the way things were going. Good money, fast close. Eli had not responded to the letter. He stood at the river and drank his cold coffee and watched the water and thought about his father. His father had bought this land in 1974 for what was, at the time, too much money. He had carried the banknote for 20 years. 20 years of not buying new trucks when the old ones were worn out, not taking vacations, not replacing equipment until it broke twice instead of once. And then one morning, when Eli was 25 and standing right here at this same bend in the river, his father had walked down, stood next to him, and said, "Now it's ours." Just that. "Now it's ours." Eli had nodded. He thought he understood. He didn't, not completely. Not until now, when the understanding had come too late to be anything but a weight. He turned from the river and walked back up through the dark toward the barn. The fence on the north pasture had been hit by cattle overnight. One of the younger steers got jumpy, something spooked it in the dark, and a whole section of wire had come down. Eli found it at first light, pulled on his gloves, and got to work. He had his tools laid out on the tailgate of his truck: wire cutters, fencing pliers, a spool of 12-gauge wire, a post driver for the stake that had pulled loose. He worked methodically. He had been fixing fence since he was old enough to hold the pliers without dropping them. His hands knew the work. On the old cedar post at the corner of the section, somebody had carved a letter C into the wood a long time ago. Eli had carved it. He was 19 years old, full of something that felt like certainty back then. Calloway. He was going to put his name on every corner post on this land. He never did more than this one. He used the same pocket knife now to strip the plastic coating off a wire splice. Same knife, 33 years later. He was almost done with the fence when he thought about the notice. Ray Duncan, his neighbor, had put a help-wanted flyer on the board at Briggs Hardware in town 2 days ago. Ray had done it without asking, which was typical Ray. He had mentioned it afterward, casually, like it was nothing. And Eli had said he didn't need any help. And Ray had said something under his breath that Eli chose not to acknowledge. Eli had driven into Clover Creek yesterday for wire and cattle supplies, and had seen the flyer on the board at Briggs. Help wanted, temporary ranch work, contact Calloway Ranch. He had looked at it for a moment. Then he had taken it down, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He didn't need someone showing up and seeing the state of things. The barn roof, the 12 cows, the pump with the bad seals, the truck that burned a quart of oil every 400 miles. He had thrown the flyer in the public trash bin on Main Street. Drove home. The silver SUV was parked at his gate when he got back. A woman stood beside it. She was holding a piece of paper. Eli pulled up, got out. He could see as he walked toward her that the paper was the flyer. His flyer. The one he had thrown away. She was maybe late 40s. Dark hair, pulled back. She was wearing practical clothes, the kind people wear when they actually intend to work. Not new, not performative. She stood easily, like someone comfortable with open ground. Eli said, "Can I help you?" She held up the paper. "I'm here about the job." He looked at the flyer, looked at her. "How'd you get that?" "I found it," she said. He considered this. "Works hard," he said. "Physical, long days during fall closeout." "I know what ranch work is," she said. "You from around here?" "No." "Experience?" "Some," she said. He studied her for a moment. He was going to say no. He had come home intending to say no to whoever showed up. The problem was that he had 12 cattle to move to the winter pasture in 3 weeks, a barn roof that was not going to patch itself, and 36 days before a bank was going to take everything anyway. He said, "I can only pay $280 a week, below what you'd get anywhere else. I'm going to tell you that straight." She said, "All right. Not all right. Let me think about it." "Not all right. What about benefits?" "Just all right, immediately," like the number didn't surprise her at all. Eli looked at her hands. He always looked at people's hands when he was thinking about hiring them. Her hands were not soft. There were calluses across the palm. A small scar on the back of her left hand, healed white. He said, "What's your name?" "Nora," she said. "Nora Vasquez." "Eli Calloway," he said. He did not extend his hand. Neither did she. "You want to see the barn?" He walked her to the barn. Cleo was in her stall, the old mare 16 years old and irritable with strangers since she'd had a bad year 2 years back and never quite got over it. When Nora came through the barn door, Cleo looked at her, ears forward. The mare took one step toward the stall door. Eli noticed this. Cleo did not do that. Nora looked around the barn without commenting on any of it. She checked the feed situation briefly with her eyes. She noted the water line. She was not making an inventory out loud. She was just seeing. She said, "I can start Monday." Eli said, "Monday works." She left a number on a torn piece of paper, just Nora V, and a phone number. She got in her SUV and drove out through the gate. Eli stood in the yard and watched the dust settle. That night he sat at the kitchen table. He held the scrap of paper with her name and number. He did the math again. 280 a week, not negotiated. No conditions. No questions about benefits or housing or what the days would look like. Nobody took a number like that without asking at least one thing. Not unless the work wasn't why they came. He looked out the kitchen window toward the river. It was dark, but there was a road light far out on the county road that threw a pale reach across the south fence and the field beyond it, and if you knew where to look, you could just barely make out the line of the riverbank. There was a figure standing at the water, still. Just standing there, looking at the water. Standing in exactly the spot where Eli stood every morning. He watched for a moment. The figure didn't move, didn't know anyone was watching. Eli set his mug on the table. For the first time in 3 weeks, he was not thinking about the envelope in his jacket pocket. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time, but he went to bed. Monday morning, 4:45, Eli came downstairs in the dark, put the kettle on, filled his thermos. He put on his jacket and his boots and walked out into the cool October air. He came around the corner of the barn toward the river path. She was already there. Nora Vasquez was standing at the water's edge, his spot. The flat white rock, the old oak leaning out over the bank, the bend where the current slowed slightly. She was standing with her arms at her sides, and she was looking at the water. Eli stopped. He stood there for a moment on the path. He could go back, find another place to stand, wait until she came up for breakfast, and then come down. He didn't do any of those things. He walked down to the river and stopped about 12 feet to her left. He looked at the water. She did not acknowledge him. He did not acknowledge her. The Verde moved past, slow in October but steady. The fog was on the surface. Somewhere upstream a bird called once and then went quiet. After 15 minutes, the sun began to show above the Mazatzal range. Eli drank from his thermos. He turned and walked back toward the house. When he looked back from the path, she was still standing there. He went in and started breakfast. She showed up for work at 7 o'clock exactly, which was the time he had told her. He had a list written on a yellow legal pad. He handed her a copy. She read it. She picked up a pen from the kitchen counter. She underlined item 4, which said, "Patch water trough, use concrete." She wrote next to it, "Rubber lining is better, faster, and won't crack in the freeze." She handed the list back to him. Eli looked at what she'd written. He didn't say anything. He folded the list and put it in his pocket. The next morning, the trough was patched with rubber, exactly the way she had suggested. He crossed that item off faster than he crossed off anything else on the list. He didn't mention it. Neither did she. The days had a structure. Eli was a list man. Everything went on a list. The list got done. This was how the ranch ran, or had run, back when it ran properly. Now the list was always longer than one man could finish, which meant things carried over day after day, a kind of debt in task form. Nora did not argue with the list. She just sometimes made suggestions, in writing mostly. A note left on the counter, a word added next to an item. She was never pushy about it. She offered, and then she let it go. On day 3, she fed the cattle 20 minutes earlier than the schedule called for, on a morning when the temperature was going to push past 85 by mid-morning. The cattle ate more, produced better that afternoon. Eli adjusted the morning feed time the next day without telling her. She noticed and didn't say anything. He noticed that she noticed. Nobody said anything. On day 5, she reorganized the tool wall in the barn from size order to frequency of use order. Eli spent 10 full seconds looking for the needle nose pliers in the wrong spot. He found them. He didn't comment on the reorganization, but he memorized where she had put things, because the system was actually better. By day 7, they had a morning rhythm. She rose before he did. She was already at the river when he came down. They stood there together in the early dark, 12 feet apart, and watched the water without speaking. Then they went up for coffee, then work. It was efficient. That was all Eli told himself it was. Wednesday of the second week, a storm came in off the west. Arizona in October doesn't often give you rain, but when it does, it comes fast, and it comes without much warning. They were out on the north fence line, the section that kept having trouble, and they had maybe 45 seconds from the first smell of rain on the wind to the moment it came down for real. No time to get back to the barn. The rain on dry Arizona earth has a smell unlike anything else, heavy and sweet at the same time. Petrichor and red dust. Eli had known that smell since he was 4 years old. He watched Nora lift her face when it hit, eyes closed for just a second, the way you do when something reaches you before you have time to stop it. The fence wire got twice as heavy wet. She didn't comment on it. She just shifted her grip and kept working. The temperature dropped 17 degrees in 20 minutes. Eli had one rain jacket in the truck, which was back at the barn, which was no good to either of them. He took his dry bandana from his back pocket and hung it on the fence post between them. Not handing it to her, not using it himself, just putting it in the middle. It was a small and inadequate thing. It was what he had. In the sound of rain on hard-packed earth, he heard her humming, low, half under her breath. Something with a minor key feel to it, something he didn't recognize. When he glanced over, she had already stopped, looking at the wire in her hands. They finished the section in the rain. By the time they got back to the barn, both of them were soaked through. She changed her clothes in the storage room that served as her quarters. He changed in the house, they met in the kitchen, and neither of them mentioned the rain. Dinner that night was the first one they both sat through to the end. Eli was not a dinner table talker. Margaret had called this his worst quality, which was saying something, because she had a full list. He ate quickly. He got up quickly. He found the kitchen uncomfortable once the food was done. Some old instinct about wasted time. Nora brought a paperback to the table. She read it while she ate. She wasn't ignoring him. She was just not requiring anything from him either. When Eli started to push his chair back, she said, without looking up from her book, "Coffee's still in the pot." Not an invitation, a statement of fact. He pulled his chair back in. He poured another cup. He sat there for 20 more minutes while she read, and he looked out the window at the dark yard. It was the most comfortable 20 minutes he'd spent at that table in years, maybe longer. From somewhere past the dark, the river. She was at the river again before him the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning since. He started coming down 5 minutes earlier than he used to. He didn't examine why. Dale Merritt drove out to Callaway Ranch on a Monday morning in the third week. He came without calling ahead. That was unusual. Dale was a phone-ahead kind of man. Eli heard the truck come up the drive and came out of the barn to meet him. Nora was on the other side of the property, fixing the irrigation line by the south pasture. Eli could just see the line of her through the scrub 100 yards off. Dale got out of his truck. He was wearing pressed slacks and a collared shirt, the way he always did, even out to ranches. The shoes were polished, but the heels were worn, and the shirt collar was starting to fray. A man trying to look solid in the seams. They shook hands. They didn't go inside. Dale said, "I'll say this straight, Eli, because you've always been a straight man, and you deserve the same. I have to start foreclosure proceedings November 15th if I don't have at least 40% of the outstanding balance. That's not a threat. It's just the situation." Eli said, "I know the situation." Dale looked at the ground. He looked at the barn. He looked at the line of cottonwoods along the river. "There's a group out of Phoenix. They've looked at properties in this corridor. They move fast and they pay close to ask. I could pass them your number." "Don't do that," Eli said. Dale was quiet for a moment. He pulled a card from his shirt pocket and held it out. "If you change your mind." Eli didn't take it. Dale put the card back. He started toward his truck. He got to the driver's door, opened it, and stopped. He put his hands on the door frame and looked back. He said, "My boy Danny, he's 14. They found leukemia in the spring. He's on his third round of chemo right now. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel bad for me. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I'm also trying to keep something together. Same as you, different something. He got in the truck. He drove out the gate. Eli stood in the yard until the dust was gone. There was no villain here. That was the part nobody warned you about. You thought it was going to be a villain, something clean, something you could push against. But sometimes it was just two men, each one losing a different thing, unable to help each other, because the system they were inside didn't make room for it. That night, Nora cooked dinner. She didn't usually cook dinner. She was making something on the stove when Eli came in from his evening round, and the smell of it hit him in the doorway, garlic and something warm. He washed up, he sat at the table. She put a bowl in front of him. Chicken with hominy, the way his mother used to make it, though Eli didn't say that, and Nora couldn't have known it. They ate. After a while, she said, "How much time do you actually need, specifically?" He said, "That's not your concern." She set her fork on the rim of the bowl. No heat in it. Just placed it there, quietly. "Fair enough," she said. She picked the fork back up. Eli heard that and felt something uncomfortable he couldn't name. She hadn't argued, she hadn't pushed. She had just accepted his answer and moved on. Somehow that bothered him more than if she'd pushed back. Like there was something more honest in her letting it go than in any argument she could have made. They ate the rest of the meal without speaking. He thought about Dale. He thought about the 36 days, which were now 33. He thought about his father standing at the river saying, "Now it's ours." He did not think about the woman sitting across the table, except for the part where he couldn't stop thinking about her. The next Wednesday, Eli drove into Clover Creek for lumber to patch the east barn roof. He came down Main Street and passed the county library. Nora's silver SUV was parked out front. He slowed without planning to. Through the plate glass window of the library, he could see the reading room and beyond it the archive section, the old shelves and flat drawers where they kept the local history materials. Nora was standing at those shelves. She had a box of something open in front of her, and she was photographing pages with her phone. Newspaper pages, it looked like. Old ones. Eli sat in his truck on the other side of the glass for a moment. He drove to the hardware store. He bought the lumber. He drove home. He could not turn off the image. Thursday, he was digging out a water line on the west side of the property, the section closest to where the Verde curved before straightening back south. This was old ground that didn't get much traffic. The soil was harder here, clay heavy, holding itself together like it had something to protect. His shovel hit something that wasn't rock. He put the shovel down and crouched. He cleared the dirt with his hands. It was a small river stone, smooth and pale, the kind you'd pick up because it was pretty and then carry in your pocket. Someone had scratched letters into it. He held it up in the afternoon light. RV, it read, and below that, 1971. Eli looked at the stone for a long time. He put it in his shirt pocket and went back to the house. That night, he opened his laptop on the kitchen table. The Arizona State Land Department had put the old deed records online years back. Rural property transfers going back to the 1940s. He typed in his own parcel number. Pulled up the chain of title. He found it. 1974, purchased by Walter Calloway. Before that, 1971. Listed under the name of the seller, Rosa Vasquez, Actor RV. He closed his eyes. Opened them. He typed into a search window, Nora Vasquez, Arizona. LinkedIn came up second, a profile photo. A woman who looked like the woman in his barn. It said, Nora Vasquez, landscape conservation architect, based in Tucson, Arizona. He read that line 4 times. Then he shut the laptop. He stood up. He walked to the back door. He went outside and down to the river in the dark, and he stood at the water's edge, and he watched the Verde move in the dark, which is what he did when he didn't know what else to do. The river did not tell him anything. It kept moving. That was all. Nora had not lied to him. He ran through every word she had said since she pulled up to his gate. She had said her name. She had said she had some ranch experience. She had said she could start Monday. None of it was untrue. He was standing in the dark, feeling deceived by someone who had not deceived him. Both of those things were true at the same time. He stayed at the river long enough to understand that. When he went back inside, there was a cup of tea on the kitchen table, a mug she had left out before going to the storage room for the night. Gone cold. Had been waiting for a while. He didn't drink it. He didn't pour it out. He went to bed. The next morning, before Nora was up, Eli walked out to her truck. He told himself he was going to get the spare fence staples he thought he'd left on her passenger seat the day before. The door was unlocked. He opened it. The staples were there. He picked them up. On the back seat was her laptop bag. An envelope had slipped out of the unzipped pocket. Wells Fargo, private banking. He could see the header from where he stood. He reached in to put the envelope back, and as he did, his eye caught the balance line at the top. He did not read the exact number. He didn't have to. The number of digits told him everything. He put the envelope back. He closed the door. He stood in the morning air next to her truck and looked at the river. $280 a week. She had said all right before he finished the sentence. He went to feed Cleo. The mare ate without fuss. Eli stood in the stall for a long time, hand on the mare's neck, thinking about all the moments in the past 3 weeks that had just shifted their meaning. The way Nora had turned down the rain jacket. Not because she was tough, because she didn't want to owe him anything. The way she'd taken the storage room and said it was fine. Not because she had no options, because she wanted to be on this land on her own terms. The way she'd asked once about the bank situation and then never brought it up again when he shut her down. Not because she didn't care, because she was being careful. When she came out of the storage room that morning, she crossed the yard toward the barn and saw him standing there next to her truck. She said, "Need to borrow it?" He said, "No, thanks." He walked away without looking back. For the next 2 weeks, Eli was polite. That was the word for it. Not warm, not cold. Polite. He communicated through the daily lists left on the kitchen table instead of handed over. He ate breakfast before she came up. He did not stop at the river for his 15 minutes in the mornings because he did not want to stand there with her. Actually, that is not the whole truth. He went to the river. He went earlier. At 4:30 to make sure she wasn't there yet, or if she was, he could be gone before she came down. Some mornings he made it. Some mornings he looked up and she was already at the water, and he stood there 12 feet away and watched the river and said nothing. And she said nothing, and the river kept going. They worked together without friction. She was good at the work. He had known within the first week that she was good at it, that she had real knowledge of what she was doing and not just a willing attitude. But now there was a film between them, glass, something that made every efficient transaction feel also like a door closing. He was doing this. He knew he was doing it. He didn't know how to stop. Wednesday night of the 5th week, the phone rang at 10 o'clock. Sunrise Pines, the display said. The nursing facility where his mother had lived since her hip surgery 2 years back. The nurse's voice was calm. "Your mother's having some respiratory trouble. Nothing critical, but she's asking for you." Eli put on his jacket and drove the 45 minutes into Clover Creek, and then out the other side to the care facility. His mother, June Calloway, was 78 years old and weighed maybe 110 pounds. She had come from stock that produced small, fierce women, and she was no exception. She was sitting up in the bed with a pulse ox on her finger when Eli came through the door, and she looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for when she thought he was making a mistake. "You look terrible," she said. "You're the one with the oxygen monitor," he said. "I'm in a care facility. This is normal. You look like a man who's sleeping wrong." She patted the chair beside the bed. He sat down. "What's going on at the ranch?" He told her about the bank situation. She already knew the general shape of it, but he told her the specifics. November 15th, 40%, Dale Merritt. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "And what else? That's enough, don't you think?" "There's something else," she said. "You have a look." He said nothing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the way she had of pivoting without warning, "Do you know what I remember about the Vasquez family?" Eli went still. His mother didn't notice or pretended not to. Rosa Vasquez. She and her husband lived on that riverland before your grandfather bought it. This would be early 70s. I was young then. Your father and I were just married. We'd drive out that road sometimes on Sunday evenings. She paused. Rosa Vasquez was the best dry land cotton grower in the Verde Valley. She had a way with that hard soil. She'd walk her fields and you'd think she was just walking, but she was reading it, like the ground told her things. Eli said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your grandfather bought that land when she left," his mother said. "And your father used to say the land had been waiting for the right keeper." She looked at him. "He said that more than once. Are you keeping it right, Eli?" He drove home through the dark without turning the radio on. The kitchen light was on when he came through the back door. He'd been gone since 10, and it was past 1 in the morning. Nora was at the table. She had a photograph in front of her, black and white. A woman standing beside a river at a flat white rock under the lean of an old oak tree. Standing in the spot Eli had stood every morning for 20 years. The woman in the photograph was maybe 30, maybe a little younger. She was looking at the water. Nora was looking at the photograph the way people look at something that cost them something they can't get back. Eli came in. He filled a glass of water at the sink. He sat down at the far end of the table. He didn't ask. He just sat. After a while, without looking at him, Nora said, "My grandmother died 8 months ago. I didn't make it back in time." Eli did not say he was sorry. He did not say she must have understood. He did not say anything. He just stayed in his chair. She said, "She told me I had to come out here. She said, stand at the river. She said, let the land remember that we're still here." A pause. "I didn't understand that when she said it. I'm not sure I understand it now." "Was this her land?" Eli asked. He kept his voice level. No accusation in it. Nora looked up. It was the first time she looked at him fully. Not like a coworker. Not like a woman being careful around a man she doesn't quite trust. Just directly. "Not hers," she said, "but she lived here, before my family had to leave." "I know," Eli said. She was quiet for a moment. "Since when?" "About a week and a half." She looked at the photograph. "Are you angry?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "Is that a real answer?" "Yes." They sat in the kitchen for another half hour. Neither of them said much more. But when Eli got up to go to bed, she was still at the table, and she did not look as alone as she had when he'd come in. The next morning, 4:50, he came down the path toward the river. She was already there. She was always already there. But this morning, when he walked up to his spot, she shifted slightly to her right, making 2 or 3 feet of room beside her without making a point of it. He stepped into that space. They stood 6 feet apart instead of 12 and watched the fog burn off the water as the sun came up over the Mazatzal range. He thought, 20 years at this river alone, and I never knew I was waiting for anything. He didn't say it, he just thought it, there in the early light, and let the river take it. It was a Saturday afternoon in the 4th week, warm for October, and Eli suggested something he had never suggested in the history of Callaway Ranch, taking the afternoon off. Not the whole afternoon. They did a slow drainage check along the river corridor. It counted as work. But the pace was walking pace, not working pace, and the mood was different. They walked alongside the Verde, checking the spots where the bank was soft, and the runoff from the upper pasture came in. Nora had her notebook. Eli knew the terrain. He knew where the water went sideways in a heavy rain, which corners held and which didn't, which sections of bank had been rebuilding since the last big flood year. He talked, more than he usually did. It came out in pieces, the way it does when someone is not used to talking and has started without quite intending to. He said, "My dad bought this land in '74, paid it off in 1994. 20 years of debt. Day he cleared the note, he came down to the river, stood right where we're standing and said, 'Now it's ours.'" Nora said, "You were there?" "I was 25, standing right next to him." "What did you say?" "Nothing." I nodded. He paused. "I thought I understood. I didn't. Not all the way. Do you understand it now? I'm about to lose it, he said. So I understand it differently. They walked. After a while, Nora said, "Did you ever think your father might have been wrong about the idea that it was his?" The question sat in the air, not an accusation, not a trap. The question of a person thinking about something much larger than the conversation they were in. Eli didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "Never thought that. Not until recently." She nodded, but didn't press. They turned back toward the house. When they got to the yard, Nora stopped before going through the back door. She said, "Eli, I need to tell you something." He stopped. She said, "My grandmother's name was Rosa Vasquez. She and my grandfather lived on this land until 1971. They raised cotton here. They knew the water cycles and the soil and which sections to rest between plantings. This was their home." She stopped. He waited. In 1971, a real estate broker came to them. He knew that the federal irrigation project upstream was going to increase land values in this corridor significantly. He talked them into selling. The price he offered was below what the land would be worth in 2 years, which he knew, and they didn't. They didn't have a lawyer. They didn't fully understand the contract in English. It wasn't violence. Nobody put a gun to anyone. It was just a system where one side had information and legal protection, and the other side had neither. Eli said, "And you knew about my bank situation before you came out here?" "Yes." "How long before?" "Before I drove out to ask about the job." He turned away from her. He looked toward the river. The Verde was out there between the cottonwoods, doing what it always did, moving, steady, indifferent to what was happening on the bank above it. Here was the thing that nobody told you about the fourth twist. You expected it to be a betrayal. You expected it to be ugly. You expected to be angry, in the simple, clean way that anger is supposed to feel. But the truth she was telling him was not ugly. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't tricked him. She had come to this land because her grandmother asked her to, and she had stayed because something kept pulling her back, and she had held the boundary about the bank situation because she didn't know where the line was between helping and taking over, and none of it was dishonest. And all of it meant they had spent a month living inside a misunderstanding that never had to happen. That was what hurt. Not that she was bad. That they had wasted time. He said, "You should have told me from the start." She was quiet. Then, "Maybe so." That evening, Nora packed. She didn't have much with her. She had always traveled light. Eli sat in the kitchen and heard the sounds from the storage room, the zip of the bag, the soft thud of the door. He heard her cross the yard. He heard the engine start. He did not get up. She was not leaving in anger. He knew that. She was leaving because she had spent 4 weeks in a place that meant something enormous to her family, and had begun to mean something enormous to her in a different way. And she didn't know what she had the right to want anymore. He understood that. He did not get up. 3 in the morning. He sat at the kitchen table. Her number was in his phone, a touch away. He did not call. Not because he didn't want to. Because he didn't know what right he had to ask her to come back. She had come here for her own reasons. He had hired her for his reasons. That wasn't a foundation you could build a request on. That's what he told himself. He sat there telling himself this while the clock on the wall, the one his father had set 3 minutes fast, ticked its way toward 4 in the morning. This kind of pride looks like dignity from the outside. From the inside at 3 in the morning, it feels like sitting alone in a kitchen because you don't know how to ask for the one thing you actually need. He went to the river at 4. No coffee. He had forgotten to make any. She was not there. The spot was empty. The flat white rock, the old oak leaning over the water. Empty. He stood in the dark and felt the land in a way he hadn't felt it since his father died. Not quiet. Not peaceful. Empty. Those were different things. He had always thought they were the same. They were not. He made a decision before the sun came up. He would call Dale Merritt in the morning. He would take the Phoenix developer's number. He would sell. because he could not keep holding on to things by himself without the holding becoming damage. He stood at the river until the sun was fully up. He didn't want to look at it. That was a new feeling, 20 years in. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He stared at the wall. He did not call Dale, not yet. Ray Duncan came by Monday morning, drove up without calling, which was always how Ray operated. He had 2 dogs in the back of his truck and a cup of coffee from the gas station in Clover Creek. He found Eli in the barn, packing things into a crate. Ray said, "What are you doing?" Eli said, "Clearing out." Ray sat up on the fence rail the way he did when he planned to be there a while. "Clearing out to go or to stay?" "I'm selling to the Phoenix Group," Eli said. Ray drank his gas station coffee. "Saw Nora at the Sunrise Cafe this morning." Eli kept packing. "She looked like she hadn't slept," Ray said. "And before you tell me it's none of my business, I already know that." He set his coffee on the rail. "Here's what is my business. 6 years, Eli. 6 years I've been watching you run this place like a man trying not to drown, keeping everyone at arm's length, not asking for anything from anybody, acting like accepting help is some kind of failure." He paused. "And then for 4 weeks you did not look like that, and now you look like that again." Eli said, "You don't know what happened." "I know what I saw," Ray said. "And I know one thing about you. When you let someone help you, even a little, even just by being in the same room, you're better at everything. Better rancher, better thinker, better man." He climbed down from the rail. "I also put that flyer up at Briggs in case you were still wondering." He walked to his truck. He opened the door. He looked back. He said, "You know what the difference is between keeping land and holding on to it? Keeping is alive. Holding on is just not letting go." He drove out the gate. Eli stood in the barn. Cleo watched him from the stall. He went inside. He opened the desk drawer and took out his father's note card. He turned it over to the backside. The list. 14 items on the list. Promises he hadn't kept. Payments he couldn't make. A conversation he'd avoided. A goodbye he'd said wrong. He'd been adding to this list for 20 years as a kind of penance, though he never used that word for it. At the bottom of the list, one blank line. He picked up a pen. He wrote, "Do not sell the land for the wrong reason." He set the pen down. He picked up the phone and called Dale Merritt. He said, "Dale, I'm not going with the Phoenix Group. Give me 30 days. I have something else in mind." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eli, I don't have a lot of room here." 30 days, Eli said. "That's all I'm asking." A pause. "All right, 30 days." Eli hung up. He sat at the table for a while. Then he got out a clean sheet of paper and began to write. Not an email, not a text. He wrote by hand, slowly and carefully, the way he did when he needed what he was writing to be real. Wednesday, he drove into Clover Creek. He parked in front of the Blue Sage, which was the small inn on Mesquite Street where most visitors to Clover Creek ended up. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes. He was not hesitating. He was arranging something inside himself. He had made enough wrong moves in his life. This one, he wanted to make right. He went inside. The woman at the front desk called up. A minute later, Nora came down the stairs. She saw him. She stopped on the second-to-last step. He said, "Can we sit down?" They sat in the 2 chairs by the window. He put the envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. "What is this?" he said. "The USDA has a program called the Conservation Reserve Program. It supports ranchers who convert to conservation-based land management. Native plant restoration, riparian buffer work, soil health protocols. The kind of work that requires someone with a technical background in landscape conservation." She was still. He said, "My land qualifies. The Verde River Corridor is exactly the kind of property the program was designed for. With the right application, with someone who knows what they're doing putting the proposal together, we could cover a significant portion of the debt over 24 months. Keep the land. Keep it working." She said, "You know what I do?" "Yes." "Since when?" LinkedIn, about 2 weeks ago. She looked at the envelope. She opened it. She read the 2 pages inside. She stopped on the second page. He watched her read the same section twice. She said, "You're listing 30% equity in the property as part of the partnership structure." "Yes." "Your land." "Yes." She set the pages down. "Why?" He said, "Because I want you to know I trust you, and because I should have shown you that a long time ago, and I didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at Mesquite Street, the quiet October afternoon of a small town going about its business. She said, "Give me 2 days." He nodded. He stood up. He extended his hand. She shook it. He walked out the door and got in his truck and drove back to the ranch. He didn't call. He didn't text. He had done the thing that was his to do. The next part was hers. That evening, he fed Cleo on the schedule Nora had set, 20 minutes earlier than his old time. He had been doing it that way since the day she left without noticing he was doing it. He stood in the stall with his hand on the mare's neck. "You don't have to know how it turns out," he said. Though whether he was talking to the horse or himself, he couldn't have said for certain. "You just do the right thing." Cleo finished her feed without comment. He didn't call for 2 days. That was the hardest part. Not the waiting, the not calling. The not doing the thing he had done his whole life, which was to push against something until it moved, or until he broke himself against it. 2 days of feeding Cleo on Nora's schedule and patching the barn roof and not reaching for his phone every 20 minutes. He repainted the door to the storage room. He thought about this while he was doing it, and decided it didn't need explaining. He fixed the water trough again, the one that kept having problems. He used rubber lining, which was what she had suggested from the beginning, and it held. On the 3rd day, his phone rang. Her number. "I want to meet," she said, "not to answer the proposal, to say something I should have said before." "All right," he said. "Here or town?" "The river," she said. "Your side." She was standing at the water when he came down. Standing in her spot, which is to say standing in his spot, which is to say standing in Rosa Vasquez's spot, though none of them had known that in the same way at the same time until now. He walked down and stood 6 feet away. She said, "My grandmother didn't just tell me to come here and stand at the river. She said one more thing." He waited. She said, "I don't want you to come back for the land, Rosa. I want you to come back to forgive it." She paused. "I didn't know who to forgive," she said. "The broker who handled the sale in 1971 died in the 1990s. Your grandfather was gone by the time I was born. There's no one to sit across a table from. No court that addresses this kind of thing. The statute of limitations on a 50-year-old real estate transaction involving unequal legal representation is not a thing that exists." She almost laughed, but didn't quite. "So I came. I thought I'd stand here, feel whatever I was going to feel, and then understand something I hadn't understood before. And maybe go home." He said, "But..." She looked at the water. "But the land is different than I expected. It's not what you'd think coming to a place your family lost. I expected to feel angry or sad or something specific." A pause. "It's just land, beautiful land. Land that needs to be taken care of. And the man taking care of it." She stopped. He said, "Say it." She looked at him. "The man taking care of it needed someone to stay too, and I didn't come here for that. I want you to know that. That's not why I answered the ad." "I know that," he said. "I stayed because I wanted to," she said. "And that's separate. Those are 2 different things, and I have to be honest about the difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something he hadn't prepared and hadn't expected to say. He said, "Last time I wanted something like this, I went so quiet that the other person couldn't tell I needed them, and they left. And I told myself I'd understood something from that, but I'm not sure I had." She looked at him. He said, "I'm telling you now." The Verde kept moving. A heron lifted off the far bank and crossed low over the water going south. She said, We both have things to work on. Different things, though, he said. Different in a way that might actually fit together? He looked at the water. He had looked at this water for 20 years, and he had never once asked it for an answer. He wasn't asking now. He was just thinking out loud, which was something he almost never did. He said, I don't know, but I'd like to find out. They went back to the house, no dramatic scene, no moment that needed music. They went back to the house, and Nora spread out her landscape assessment notes on the kitchen table, the ones she had been making since the first week when she had walked the property under the guise of checking irrigation lines, and she laid out what she saw. She said, "This stretch of the Verde corridor has significant restoration potential. The riparian buffer has been diminished by grazing pressure over 40 years. That's normal. It's also reversible. You bring in native grass and willow along the waterline, you create a 30-foot buffer. You let the cattle back off the bank by 50 yards. Soil moisture retention goes up, erosion comes down. The productivity of the pasture actually improves over a 3-year cycle." He said, "How much of the bank are we talking about?" She pointed to her notes. He looked over her shoulder. He put his finger on a section he knew. He said, "This part floods in a wet year. You'd lose any planting in the first 20 feet. She said, "What year was the last major flood event?" He said, 2010. Before that, 1993. She said, "So we set the buffer edge back to 25 feet, and you keep the water rights intact through the conservation easement structure." He said, "The pump intake is at this bend. We'd need to protect that line." She moved her pen to mark it. Their hands were both on the same page of notes. At some point, reaching for the same point on the map, her hand was on his. Neither of them moved. They worked until it was dark outside. When they finally sat back, there was the outline of a real plan on that kitchen table. Not a hope. A plan with numbers and timelines and a list of grant program requirements and a sketch of the buffer zone drawn in pencil. That evening, Nora brought her bag back from the Blue Sage. She carried it across the yard to the storage room without asking. Eli was at the barn. He heard her car pull in. He didn't go over. Cleo stood at the stall door and watched the yard. After a while, the old mare turned back inside and settled in for the night. 3 weeks later, they filed the application. The Conservation Reserve Program through the USDA was a real thing. It existed for exactly the kind of land they were describing. Riparian restoration along the Verde River corridor, native plant establishment, prescribed grazing management, soil health monitoring. The application was 23 pages. Nora wrote the technical sections. Eli wrote the land history section and the current management practices section, which he could have written in his sleep. Ray Duncan came by while they were working on it one evening and looked at the papers spread across the kitchen table and said, "Huh." He looked at the two of them. He said, "You want me to proofread anything?" Eli said, "You're the worst reader I know." Ray said, "That's true." He left 20 minutes later, looking for once, like he didn't have anything more to say. Dale Merritt called on a Thursday. He said, "I heard from Ray Duncan that you've put something together." Eli said, "We filed a federal application for a conservation program. If it's approved, the payment structure covers the outstanding balance over 24 months. Silence on the line. Dale said, "The November 15th deadline is still the deadline, Eli. I can't move it." Eli said, "I know. I'm asking for a 60-day extension to wait on the application decision. If the application is denied, you have my word, I'll work with whatever you need." Another pause. Eli heard Dale exhale. 60 days, Dale said. And Eli, "That is the last extension I can give." "I understand," Eli said. "Thank you." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen. He heard Nora in the other room, on her laptop, doing something related to the application. He was not used to the feeling of having someone in the other room. He was not used to tasks being divided. He had run this ranch alone for 6 years, every task on his own list, every decision his own. It was strange. It was not unpleasant. In town, people talked. Clover Creek was not a large town, and Eli Calloway was not a private man in the sense that his business was secret. People knew about the bank situation. They knew a woman had come to help at the ranch. They had opinions. Old Briggs at the hardware store said to Eli, while ringing up a bag of fence staples, "You sure about what you're doing out there, bringing someone in from outside?" Eli said, "Her grandmother grew cotton on that land before my grandfather bought it." Briggs stopped ringing. He looked at Eli. "Vasquez? Rose's family?" "Her granddaughter," Eli said. Briggs didn't say anything else. He put the staples in the bag. He handed Eli his change. Something had shifted in his expression. Something Eli couldn't quite name. Not friendlier exactly, but quieter. The judgment had gone somewhere. That was the best a small town could do sometimes. Let the judgment go somewhere quiet. It wasn't nothing. The work on the ranch had a different texture now. Not easier necessarily. There was still the same list of things to do, still the same acreage, still the same 1 horse and 12 cattle and a barn roof that needed constant attention. But the tasks were divided without discussion. They had learned each other's way of working, the same way you learn how to walk with someone without bumping into them. Eli started asking Nora's opinion before he made decisions, not after. It was a small change, but she noticed it, and he could tell she noticed because of the way she answered. More directly, less carefully, like she wasn't bracing for the door to close. She asked him to teach her how to read the land weather. The way you could see rain coming 3 days out, not from a forecast, but from the way the cattle held themselves, from the smell of the soil in the morning, from the color of the sky at a certain angle above the mazatzel. Her grandmother had known these things. Nora had heard them described, but never learned them directly. He taught her in the way he knew how to teach things, which was by doing them while she watched, and then letting her try while he watched, and saying very little throughout. She learned fast. She had the right kind of attention. One evening he found himself telling her about his father. Not the story he always told, which was the 20-year debt story and the river, and now it's ours. The other stories. His father teaching him to work a fence at age 8 in the cold, not saying much, just showing. His father's hands on the steering wheel of an old Ford. The specific way his father smelled after a long day. Like diesel and horses and the sharp, clean smell of dry grass. Nora listened, not making sounds to show she was listening, just actually listening in a way that meant he kept going. He took her to meet his mother. He didn't tell June ahead of time. He didn't tell Nora ahead of time. He just drove to Sunrise Pines one afternoon after the morning work was done and said to Nora, "Come with me." She said, "Where?" He said, "My mother's." She looked at him for a moment. Then she got in the truck. June was in the sunroom when they came in. She looked at Nora the way small women look at tall situations, which is to say she looked very directly and made you feel that you had been assessed down to the lining. Then she said, "You look like Rosa." Nora went still. June said, "I'm not being strange." She had the same way of standing, like she was listening to something underfoot. Nora said, "You knew my grandmother?" June said, "Anyone in the Verde Valley knew Rosa Vasquez, best dry land cotton grower this county ever produced." She gestured at the chair across from her. "Sit down. You want tea? The tea here's bad, but it's hot." They sat in the sunroom for 90 minutes. Eli sat in the corner chair and said almost nothing. He watched his mother and this woman talk about Rosa, about the land, about what the river corridor had looked like in the early 1960s before the flood management project changed the channel slightly, about the way Rosa grew cotton in rows that followed the natural water movement of the soil rather than the straight grid that everyone else used. Nora said, "She never talked about the land directly. Not to me. She'd talk around it. Seasons, weather, what grew where." June said, "People talk around things they can't get back to." Nora looked at her. June said, "You're getting back to it." There was a long quiet in the room. The sunroom at Sunrise Pines had windows facing west, and the afternoon light came in orange and warm, and his mother and this woman sat in it together, and Eli thought about his father saying, "Now it's ours." And for the first time he heard it differently, heard the thing underneath it, the gratitude, the awe, the weight. The land holds things. It doesn't give them up easily, and sometimes it takes a long time for the right people to understand what it's holding. He drove them home in the dark, without turning the radio on. Nora sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the desert going by. She didn't say much, but she put her hand on the door handle in a way that looked like holding on, not like trying to get out. The letter from the USDA came on a Tuesday. Eli found it in the box at the gate when he drove back from town with feed. He sat in the truck and opened it in the driveway because he could not wait until he got to the house. Partial approval, not the full amount they had applied for, 65% of the requested program funding. He did the math in his head right there in the truck cab with the engine ticking as it cooled and a mockingbird making noise in the mesquite. Nora's partnership investment, which she had put into the LLC they'd formed for the project, covered another portion. What Eli had saved from the cattle sales over the past months covered the rest. He added the numbers twice. It was enough. He drove up to the barn. Nora was on the south side of the property. He could see her truck down by the river. She was staking out the first section of the riparian buffer planting. He walked down. She looked up when she heard him coming. She must have seen something in his face. He said, 65% approved. She was quiet for a moment. "Does it cover it?" she said. "It covers it," he said. She nodded once, went back to her stakes. He stood there. He said, "Nora." She turned. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he didn't have a word for. Then she said, "Don't thank me. Help me finish marking this line before the sun goes." He helped her finish marking the line. Dale Merritt came to the ranch that Friday to accept the payment. He drove out himself instead of having someone from the bank come, which he didn't have to do. He shook Eli's hand in the yard. He looked at the barn. He looked at the river line. He looked at the stakes Nora had driven into the ground along the buffer zone. He said, "What's all of that going to look like in a year?" Nora said, "Willow and native grass along the bank. Cattle rotated back from the water. Better pasture productivity once the soil holds more moisture. Cleaner water in the Verde at this stretch." Dale stood and looked at it for a long moment. He said, "My boy Danny finished his last round of chemo. They think they got it." Eli said, "I'm glad to hear that, Dale." Dale nodded. He got in his truck. Before he pulled out, he rolled down the window. He said, "Your father was right about this land, Eli." He drove away. Eli stood in the yard for a while after. Nora stood next to him. They watched the dust from Dale's truck settle on the county road. He thought about Dale's son Danny, 14 years old, who didn't know that a man had driven 20 miles out to a ranch today partly because of him, and that the visit had something clean in it, not forgiveness exactly, resolution. Two men who had been opposite each other, both carrying weight, and now one of those weights was lighter. Saturday morning, the north fence line, the same section they had fixed in the rain in October, the one that kept having problems, the one where they'd stood under the old oak, waiting for the storm to pass. The air was cooler now, pushing toward winter, maybe 68 degrees in the mid-morning and clear all the way to the horizon. They were replacing the last section of wire that had been damaged in the November rain. Good work, slow work, the kind that gives you time to think. Eli set his post bar down. He said, "Do you want to stay?" Nora kept her hands on the wire. She didn't look over immediately. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning stay," he said. "Here, at the ranch. Not as a hired hand, not as a business partner, as whatever comes after all of that." She set her pliers down on the ground. She looked at the fence. She said, "My office has been asking me to come back full-time. They want me on a project in New Mexico." "I know," he said. He hadn't known, but he said it anyway because it made sense. "I could propose the Verde Corridor project as a field assignment. Work remotely from here, with site visits to Tucson when I need to be in the office." She paused. "That would mean I'm here most of the time, but not all of it. And when I'm here, I come with my work schedule and my quiet and my way of doing things." "I'm not asking you to be something you're not," he said. I know. She picked up the pliers. I'm just making sure we both know what we're agreeing to. He picked up the post bar. We both know, she said. All right then. He said, all right. They went back to work on the fence. This was their ceremony. The two of them in a field, tools in hand, agreeing to something harder than a feeling, agreeing to the work of it, agreeing to show up at the river in the dark every morning, two separate people 6 feet apart watching the same water. No ring, no pronouncement, no sunset behind them, though the sun was in the right position for it if they'd been looking. They were not looking, they were fixing fence. That night, Eli opened the desk drawer. He took out his father's note card. He read the backside, the list for the last time in a long while. He uncapped a pen. He found the last item he had added, the one about not selling the land for the wrong reason. He drew a single line through it, not crossing it out, finishing it. The way you mark something done, not something undone. He put the note card back in the drawer. He closed the drawer. Outside the window, the sound of the river, steady in the dark, the way it had been since before he was born and would be after he was gone. Cleo quiet in the barn. The October that had become November that was becoming something else. He went to bed, and he slept. April came to the Verde River corridor the way it always does, gradually and then suddenly all at once. The cottonwoods along the bank were in new leaf, that particular pale green that only lasts about 2 weeks before it deepens into summer. The native grass Nora had planted along the buffer line was taking hold. The buffalo grass and the saccaton, filling in the bank with root systems that would hold the soil through the summer monsoons. The button willow at the water's edge had leafed out and was already thick enough to give the birds something to work with. It was not a garden. It was not landscaping. It was land learning to breathe in a way that it hadn't breathed in 40 or 50 years. 4:53 in the morning, Eli stood at the river, coffee in hand. The same thermos he'd been using since December, when the old one finally gave out. The river was up slightly from the spring snowmelt coming off the Mazatzals. He could hear the extra volume in the current. Footsteps on the path behind him. She came down a few minutes after him now every morning. She had stopped arriving before him in the winter, somewhere around January, without explanation. He hadn't asked. She came 5 minutes after him and took her place 6 feet to his right. They watched the river. A week before, the survey team had been on the property. Nora had brought in a small crew to install soil moisture monitoring equipment at 4 stations along the buffer zone. Standard conservation assessment work. The crew was careful, professional, did the work clean. On the west side, near the old waterline where Eli had found the carved stone months ago, the auger bit something at 60 centimeters depth. The operator stopped the machine and called Nora over. She had dug it out by hand. A small wooden box, maybe 15 centimeters long. The wood was partly rotted, the joints soft, but the box held together. Inside was wrapped in what had once been an oilcloth rag, now mostly deteriorated, and the wrapping had kept what was inside dry enough to survive. A small silver earring, simple, a small oval shape, the wire still intact, and a folded piece of paper, which Nora had unfolded very carefully at the kitchen table that evening, with Eli sitting across from her. The paper was fragile. The ink had faded but was still readable. She translated slowly. The letter was in Spanish. She read it in a low voice, and then she read it in English. Miguel, she read. I am burying this here so the land will remember that we loved each other in this place. Even if we have to go, the land will hold it. If you find this someday, know that this was once a place of happiness. Rosa, 1970. The kitchen was very quiet. Eli looked at the earring in its little nest of disintegrated cloth. She buried it the year before they left, Nora said. She knew they were going to leave. I think so. I think they knew for a while. Nora was quiet. She didn't want to leave without leaving something. The last twist in a story is not always a revelation. Sometimes it is smaller than that. Sometimes it is just a widening of the frame. Eli had stood at this river for 20 years. His father had stood at this river before him. His grandfather had bought this land, believing it was unclaimed, believing it was available. believing that clean paperwork meant a clean start. None of them knew that before all of that, a woman named Rosa had stood at this same bend in the water and said goodbye to it in the only way she had available, which was to put something small in the ground and trust the earth to keep it. The love story of Eli Calloway and Nora Vasquez was not the first one this land had held. It was not even the second. Land does not measure in human lifespans. Land measures in water cycles and erosion rates and the slow return of root systems that were cut and then allowed eventually to grow back. This was not fate. There were no mystical forces arranging outcomes. There was a woman who listened to her grandmother, a flyer that Ray Duncan put on a board at Briggs Hardware without asking permission, a cup of tea left on a table, a horse who dropped her head for a stranger. Small things. Ordinary things, adding up the way small things do when enough of them are pointed in the same direction. At the river the morning after they talked about the box, Eli reached into his jacket pocket, the silver earring. He had carried it since the night before, not sure what to do with it. He held it out in his palm. He said, "What do you want to do with it?" Nora looked at it. She thought about it for a real moment, the way she thought about things. She said, "Put it back." He said, "Right here?" "Right here. Not because it's a sad thing, because the land has been keeping it well." He crouched down. He dug with his hands a few inches at the base of the new native grass planting, just at the water's edge. The soil was dark here, damper than it had been a year ago. Something was working. She had the box. She set it in the hollow he had made. He covered it back over. He pressed the earth flat with his palm. They stood. There is the moment at the beginning of this story. Eli Calloway at the north fence line in the dark before sunrise, cutting wire with the same knife that has his initials worn into the handle. The knife he once used to carve the letter C into a fence post because he believed everything on this land would always be his, cutting fence alone because there is no one else, trying to hold something together by surrounding it. There is a moment at the end of this story. Eli Calloway at the river's edge, digging with his bare hands, beside someone, not to claim anything, not to fence anything in, putting something back into the ground that the ground had been keeping for 54 years, returning something to a place that knew how to hold it. The circle is not complicated. It doesn't need to be explained. The Verde River kept running. The sky was not all the way light yet. The heron that lived in the tall cottonwood 200 yards upstream made its first noise of the morning, a prehistoric sound, a sound that does not belong to any particular century. Cleo, back in the barn, shifted in her stall. She had arthritis in her left front leg now, and sometimes moved in the morning before the day warmed up. But she was 16 and she was still eating, and she still watched the yard with that particular attention that told you something worthwhile was happening. Eli drank from his thermos. The coffee had gone cold at some point. He drank it anyway. He looked at the river. The river was running the same direction it always ran, south and then southeast toward the salt, toward the desert, toward the basin and all the years ahead of it. But the bank was different now. Green, where it had been bare, rooted, where it had been loose, holding the water in instead of letting it carry the ground away. The earth remembers what people put into it. Sometimes it takes a while for the right people to come back and find out what's been kept. Nora stood beside him. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. The sun came up over the mountains and put its light on the water, and the two of them stood in the long morning, quiet, in the place they had both been looking for without knowing what they were looking for, or that looking was even something they were doing. It was enough. It was more than enough. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
Before I tell you what this story means, let me tell you what it is not. It is not a story about a cowboy who saves a woman. It is not a story about a woman who saves a ranch. And it is not a love story in the way we usually mean that phrase, something that arrives loud and certain and sweeps people off their feet. This is a story about two people who had already been swept off their feet, by life, by loss. by the slow, grinding kind of damage that doesn't come from one big moment but from years of small decisions to keep the walls up and the distance wide. Eli Calloway carried his pride like a second mortgage. He believed the way men of his generation and his type often believed that needing help was the same as failing. So he sold his cattle. He lost his hands. He ran a 340-acre ranch alone. And every morning he stood at a river and watched the water move, because the river was the one thing in his life that didn't need anything from him. He had confused that silence with peace. It wasn't peace. It was just a very quiet kind of alone. Nora Vasquez carried her own version of the same wound, only hers looked different from the outside. She was capable and educated and financially secure. She had built a life that functioned beautifully and had no room in it for anyone else to stand. She had loved someone once and crowded him out without meaning to. She knew this, knowing it had not been enough to change it. The first lesson this story offers is the one we least want to hear. The armor we build to protect ourselves from being hurt is usually the same thing that prevents us from being known. Eli's silence, Nora's self-sufficiency, both of them dressed in the language of strength. Both of them, underneath, just trying not to need anyone too much. The second lesson lives in Rosa's buried letter. She wrote it in 1970, a year before her family was forced to leave land. They had worked for generations, forced out not by violence, but by something quieter and just as damaging. Unequal information, unequal access to legal protection, a system that was not designed to treat everyone the same. Rosa couldn't fight that system. She couldn't reclaim the land, so she did the only thing available to her. She buried something small and trusted the earth to hold it. That is a lesson about forgiveness that most of us have never been taught. Forgiveness does not require a recipient. It does not require justice or an apology or a courtroom. Sometimes the wrong is too old and the people responsible are too gone, and the only way forward is to put something back in the ground and trust that the ground will keep it. Not for them, for yourself. So you can stop organizing your life around the shape of what was taken. And the third lesson is the simplest and the hardest. It is the one Ray Duncan says standing at a fence rail with a gas station coffee in his hand, because the best truths in Western stories always come from the side character who has nothing to prove. Keeping is alive. Holding on is just not letting go. There is a difference between protecting something and surrounding it, between loving someone and locking them out, between standing at a river every morning because it gives you peace and standing there because you have forgotten that you are allowed to want company. Eli learns this, slowly, imperfectly, the way real people learn things. And in the end, he kneels at the edge of that river and digs with his bare hands not to claim anything, not to fence anything in, but to give something back to the ground that has been keeping it safe. That is what this story is asking of all of us. Open your hands. Let something be returned. Let someone stand beside you in the early dark 6 feet away, watching the same water. It is enough. It is more than enough.